Okay, I hope everybody was able to successfully click through. So this talk today is being presented by the UBC Centre for Migration Studies. Please feel free to take a look at the Centre for Migration Studies Twitter. The handle is @UBC Migration. Please do follow us. There are lots of events that the Centre sponsors and many interesting publications by Centre members. I'd also like to thank the organizers of today's event, Emily and Atiye, without whom we would not be able to put on any of these wonderful events. I'd also like to make a land acknowledgement and acknowledge that we are gathered today on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Musqueam people, and we are ever grateful for the generous welcome of the Musqueam people. In terms of the format that the talk is going to follow today, Professor Macklin will be speaking for 45 minutes to an hour. And after that, there will be approximately 30 to 45 minutes for question and answers. Feel free to either use the chat function and type your question into the chat box. I'd be happy to read those questions to Professor Macklin, or use the raise hand function and ask the question yourself. I now have the honor of introducing our speaker. So Professor Audrey Macklin of the Centre for Criminology and Socio-Legal Studies and the Faculty of Law at the University of Toronto hardly bears introduction. She is a renowned teacher of criminal law, administrative law, and immigration and refugee law, and researcher. Her research and writing interests include transnational migration, citizenship, forced migration, feminist and cultural analysis, and human rights. I will now turn the Zoom microphone over to Professor Macklin, and thank you everybody for being here today.
Hi, everyone. I hope you can see me now. I would like to begin by thanking Molly for that lovely introduction, and also expressing my appreciation to Emily and Atiye for the organizational labor in putting all of this together. It's a real honor to be here with you this afternoon, here in that virtual sense. And to complete what Molly began with, the land acknowledgement from where you are, I will just add that where I am is, that is the land on which Toronto and the University of Toronto operates, has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and more recently the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Today it's the meeting place and home to many Indigenous peoples from across Turtle Island. Today my topic is refugee resettlement to Canada. And that, of course, I understand as a manifestation of hospitality or welcoming of others. And I think beginning with a land acknowledgement is a reminder of the contested foundation upon which hospitality projects rest in a settler society. You can only welcome strangers to a place if that place is properly your home. Where the entitlement to lay claim to a place as home is itself contested, so too are actions taken in the name of welcoming people to your home. And while I am not going to pursue that line of inquiry today to really plumb its implications for what we are doing as a settler society, I think it is an appropriate caution that we take with us, or I bring with me to this conversation. So let me tell you roughly what the organization of my presentation today is going to be. What I'd like to do first is situate refugee resettlement at the global level as one of the so-called durable solutions to the protection needs of refugees. And so I'll situate Canada's resettlement practice in a global context. Secondly, I'd like to explain briefly Canada's refugee resettlement model, both its public stream, government-assisted refugees, and the community, or what is called the private sponsorship stream, which is the focus of my own research. And then I will introduce my current research project on private sponsorship and share with you some preliminary findings in relation to some of the themes that are emerging from the data. And I will say to you that these findings are indeed preliminary. I'm still in the process of coding data and reading through interviews and so on. So let me begin by talking about resettlement at the global level and contrasting it to what we are probably more familiar with, which is asylum seeking, refugee claims made at or within the border. So as many of you probably know, the 1951 UN Convention relating to the status of refugees focuses on those who flee across international borders. And the convention grants to those who meet the refugee definition a right against refoulement, that is to say, return to a country where the refugee faces a well-founded fear of persecution. The Refugee Convention encourages, but does not require, access to permanent settlement, that is to say, full asylum, or indeed even access to citizenship through naturalization. But an important point to keep in mind is that the right to refugee protection in the form of non-refoulement is a legal obligation that states assume when they sign on to the Refugee Convention, and that's what Canada did in 1969. In contrast, neither the Refugee Convention nor international law places any legal obligation on states to resettle refugees. And when I say resettle, I mean to transport refugees from the region where they are, typically the nearby country to which they have fled their original country of nationality, and bring them to a third country, in this case, Canada. There is no legal obligation under international law for states to resettle. So states do it as a matter of, if you will, sovereign discretion. What this means is that refugee protection in the form of asylum seeking sounds in the register of rights and justice. A refugee claimant who arrives at our border is asking Canada to fulfill a legal obligation to protect refugees. In contrast, resettlement sounds in the register of humanitarianism. States choose to act benevolently to alleviate suffering, save lives, by selecting refugees from abroad, transporting and then resettling them to Canada. They don't do it because they must, they do it because they choose to do so. And despite, or perhaps because, refugee claimants, asylum seekers, make a claim of right, they are deflected, obstructed, and discredited. They are the bad refugees, in contrast to the good refugees who wait passively and abjectly in refugee camps around the world, hoping and waiting to be chosen for resettlement by states that undertake resettlement. The important point I want to emphasize or provoke you with here is that asylum seekers, refugee claimants, are seen as challenging the sovereign power of states to control borders. That is, the sovereign power to decide who enters, who does not, and on what terms. Resettlement, on the other hand, shows sovereignty in its most flattering light. States use their unfettered discretion to decide who enters for benevolent ends, for kind humanitarian and life-saving ends. And I think it's important to keep that in mind. When Canada gets kudos, as it does, for its practices of resettlement, it is doing so not out of legal obligation, but out of choice. When a country like Germany receives almost 1 million Syrian refugees as asylum seekers, it's fulfilling a legal obligation. And I think there is an important distinction to be made about that. And let us just note, I'm sure as you all know, that the intensity and the demands placed on Germany dealing with almost 1 million asylum seekers from Syria is radically different and heavier than the responsibility undertaken by Canada. So let me say a little bit more about refugees at the resettlement internationally. I'm hoping that you can see the slide that I have here. Am I right in thinking that it's visible to all of you? I want to make sure it is before I go on.
I can't see it.
That's what I need to know. Okay, so there it is. Can you see it now?
Yes, good.
Good. All right, here we go. So these are the 2019 United Nations High Commissioner for Refugee Resettlement stats. I'm not including 2020 because although available, obviously they are distorted and skewed by the pandemic. So let me just say that in 2019, the UNHCR estimated the global refugee population at 26 million. The UNHCR then, for its own purposes, determines which proportion or which among those refugees are actually in need of resettlement. And as you can see, it was determined to be about 1.4 million, or about 5% of the total number of refugees. The UNHCR then submits to countries that engage in resettlement, like Canada and another 28 countries, those who it proposes for resettlement. Notice how much smaller the number is, less than 5% of the 1.4 million. The UNHCR really indexes the number of cases that it submits to states to the number of cases that states are willing to accept. And then even then, the number who are actually resettled is, of course, fewer. So you can see in 2019, only 63,000 and change left for resettlement. Now, obviously, there are important time lags here, so I'm not going to press too hard on these statistics, but the big picture, I think it should be immediately visible. About 5% of the world's refugees are considered by UNHCR to be in need of resettlement, and less than 5% of those in need of resettlement are actually resettled. So the odds of a refugee being resettled, it's about, I would say, about 25 refugees out of 10,000 in the world. I want to just say here that resettlement in global perspective is trivial in terms of numbers, right? It is trivial in terms of the numbers of refugees who are being hosted by states of the global south, where about 85% of the world's refugees are. It's trivial in terms of the number of asylum seekers around the world seeking protection, right? It's in some ways a rounding error. So I want to keep that in perspective, not to deny its importance, but to understand just how seldom, how rare, and how limited resettlement is as a resolution to the predicament of refugees. Okay, so I'm just going to leave the slide for a moment. Okay, so what I'd like to do now with that is turn to talking a little bit about Canada's resettlement program. We have a fascinating and important history of refugee resettlement, and I want to here give a particular shout out to Shauna Labman, who's done wonderful work in this field, as has also Jeffrey Cameron on the historical perspective. And I absolutely commend their work to you, and I'm kind of moving quickly, so I'm not going to spend much time on it. I will just say that our contemporary resettlement regime was legislated into existence in the Immigration Act in 1978. And almost immediately was road tested with the arrival of Indo-Chinese refugees through 1979 to 81. Our history of resettlement is linked to Canada's history as a settler society in at least two ways. One is long before the figure of the refugee, the refugee as legal subject existed, many immigrants to the so-called New World, to settler societies, were driven by extreme hardship, by persecution, by the very things we now understand as the causes of refugee flight. Also, in the years prior to World War II, and in a few instances after, both the government of Canada and diasporic communities did what we would now call refugee sponsorship in an informal way to enable refugees to resettle to Canada. This was not done under the official label, but it set a kind of precedent. Now, the 1978 Immigration Act created two classes of resettled refugees, and a third has now been added to that classification. So I'm just going to show you what those are and explain them a bit. Okay, so refugees to Canada today are resettled in one of three classes, and the first two are by far the most dominant. The first are government-assisted refugees. These are people who are publicly sponsored. I'll explain what that means in a moment. The second category, private sponsorship, or what I'd call community sponsorship. So in the first instance, the government selects who the refugees are to be resettled, usually on the recommendation of the UNHCR or some organization subcontracted by the UNHCR. The government provides 1 year of financial support, which is equivalent to what individuals or families would receive under provincial social assistance regimes. And then also through settlement agencies, assists refugees in becoming integrated and settling into Canada through provision of assistance in locating accommodation, education, healthcare, documents, job search, and so on. Private sponsorship or community sponsorship inserts groups of private citizens into this system. Rather than the government providing a year of income support, it is a group of sponsors who come together, form a group, and they provide, through fundraising or otherwise, a year's worth of income support. They select or can select which refugees can be resettled from abroad, although those people who are chosen still have to fit the definition of a convention refugee, or what's called the country of asylum class. Once they arrive, the sponsors are responsible for doing a lot of the, if I can put it this way, the heavy lifting, the quotidian tasks of resettlement, from meeting people at the airport to helping find accommodation, to assisting people in registering for language training, education, healthcare, document acquisition, and so on. They provide, if you will, their own social capital. They lend it, if you will, to refugees to assist them in settlement and integration. In both cases, the financial responsibility ends at 12 months. And so there is a discourse of the so-called month 13. Let me just say that if at the end of the first year, the refugees or the refugee family are not self-sufficient, they can access income assistance like any other permanent resident or citizen. A new category added in 2013 is what's called the blended visa office referral. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, only to say that it's kind of a hybrid between the two. So the income support is split 50-50. Government provides 6 months worth, sponsor provides 6 months worth. And the refugees are in effect selected by the government via the UNHCR rather than by the individual sponsors. Now, historically, a lot of the refugee sponsorship in Canada was undertaken by faith-based organizations. This was true historically, this was true with the Indo-Chinese resettlement for a variety of reasons, but faith-based organizations, along with diasporic organizations, have been and continue to be the backbone of refugee resettlement in Canada. And there are a lot of interesting questions and discussions that one can have about the role of faith-based organizations. One thing I will emphasize, however, is that certainly in the contemporary era, faith-based organizations, whether churches, mosques, synagogues, or otherwise, typically take it as a principle that they do not differentiate, select, or prefer refugees that they sponsor on the basis of faith. So it's not as if typically churches are seeking to sponsor Christians, mosques are only seeking to sponsor Muslims, Jewish organizations or synagogues, Jewish refugees, and so on. Diasporic organizations have a somewhat different orientation to it, of course. Now, in terms of numbers, what I'd like to do is show you a little bit, just a quick graph that will give you an idea of the volume and distribution of refugee resettlement over the years. So this, sorry, folks. Okay. So I hope you can see here that in 1980, this was at the height of the Indo-Chinese refugee resettlement. You see it starting there with a big spike, and going through to what I think is about 2019, and you can see the ebb and the flow and the big spike again with the Syrian resettlement. Something else I'd like you to notice here is the distribution between government assisted in green and privately sponsored in blue. And there's a small space for blended visa office referral. I'm not going to talk about it much right now. But I think what you can see is fluctuations in the proportions. And one point I'd like to make is something that is extremely important to those who engage in resettlement as a foundational principle. And it's what they call the principle of additionality. And it's this. It is the idea that while private sponsorship is critical, vital, and something that the organizations and people who do it feel deeply committed to, it should never be understood as replacing or substituting for a purely public commitment to refugee resettlement. And this, I think, is an important principle for those who are committed to sponsorship, because they do not want to actually endorse the privatization of what should be a public commitment or responsibility to resettle refugees to Canada. Now, this is a kind of difficult to enforce idea, but you can see that over the years, there is often a kind of rough 50-50 kind of split between the public and the private. But it's not, in a sense, enforceable, but it is guarded most strongly by those who do private sponsorship. They emphatically do not want to be understood as, in a sense, endorsing a privatization of the public responsibility. And so there's always this kind of delicate balancing going on. Now, I will leave this for the moment. Okay. All right. Now, what I'd like to do now is really move on to asking the question, what am I doing with all of this? I embarked on a study of private sponsorship in 2017 with the support and assistance of the Trudeau Foundation, for which I am very grateful. And I decided to collaborate with social scientists in this task, because I realized as a legal scholar, my skill set's pretty limited. And really, what I wanted to do was embark on an inquiry. If I can just do this, that asks the following questions. Why study private sponsorship? What's interesting about it? What are we going to do? What is our study going to be about? And what are our preliminary findings? So this is what I want to talk with you about today. Why do it? What did we do? What are we finding? The team, the names are up there. We are from a variety of disciplines, because I thought it was important to not just approach this as a theoretical question, but to do it in a real granular way and to actually try to produce empirical data about these questions. And so the big question that I went into this was about not what does sponsorship do for people who are sponsored, which is the subject of a lot of people's research, but rather, what does refugee sponsorship do for sponsors or do to sponsors? And what impact does this have on Canadian society at large? And so the big question, as you can see that I posed, is how does the project of making refugees into citizens remake the citizenship of sponsors? What does it do for us? How does it do it? And in a sense, what are the implications? In order to pursue this line of inquiry, we adopted two mechanisms, two instruments. One was an online survey of sponsors. We got about 530 responses. It's what's called a convenience sample. It's not a random sampling. And we followed this up with over 85 in-person interviews to really probe more deeply in a qualitative way into the questions: who sponsors? Why do they sponsor? What are their motives? What is the modality of sponsorship? What do they do as sponsors? And what are the effects of sponsorship on them, and by extension, on us? Now, in other presentations I've done about this much earlier, I spend more time kind of laying out a theoretical and conceptual framework. And I'm just identifying here some of the theoretical resources that I draw on and that I hope to return to as we analyze the data. But today, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the theory, although I'm delighted to answer questions about it. In fact, I want to spend more time talking about what our preliminary findings are, because I'm quite interested in this idea, not of spinning out a theory and then looking for data that will support it, but actually starting at the ground up and looking at, listening to, finding out what sponsors do, what they say, what their experiences are, and then, in a sense, trying to theorize it. But some of those resources are what you see here: ideas about hospitality, which I think taps into an idea of cosmopolitanism, this claim that we owe moral obligations to those who we define as other, whoever those may be. Ideas about privatization, right? This idea that sponsorship of refugees, to the extent that it privatizes it, poses a threat to a kind of public commitment to resettlement and to, if you will, public hospitality. Ideas of parentalism, which is kind of a phrase I'm coining and I'll explain later. Inequality, because frankly, inequality is baked into relationships between sponsors and refugees for a variety of reasons that I assume is probably apparent to many of you. And of course, the concept of citizenship as both a status, a membership, but also as a practice, as acts of citizenship. And finally, ideas of solidarity, which I would describe as a kind of more politicized understanding of relationship to the other. Okay, so this really just explains, this slide just sets out what I described as what we are trying to do. Maybe what I'll just spend a moment on, though, is why focus on sponsors? So let me answer quickly by saying, obviously, the refugees are the people who, in some sense, matter most here. And we should be primarily interested in who they are, how they come, what their experiences are, how to, in a sense, ensure that their experiences is as constructive and fruitful for them as possible, and really how we can perhaps expand resettlement. All of that is true. The reason I'm looking at sponsors, though, is partly because not a lot of research has been done on sponsors, but secondly, because from a policy perspective, if you think refugee resettlement is a good thing, if you think private sponsorship is a good thing, and if you would like to see it perpetuated, expanded, promoted, encouraged, then it matters that sponsorship works, not just for refugees who are resettled, by whatever metric you measure working or success by. It also, in a sense, has to work for those who do it, or they won't do it, they won't do it again, they won't encourage others to do it. Okay. So that's, in a sense, a bit of the rationale behind researching sponsors. So what I'll do here is tell you a little bit about what our online survey revealed to us about the demographics of sponsors. Now, I remind you here that what we did was a convenience sample. What that means is that we distributed the survey far and wide, but people, of course, chose to answer for whatever reasons they had for wanting to participate in the survey. So we can't claim that our survey is a random sampling. So we can't claim that it's representative of the entire population of people who sponsor. So please bear that in mind. But here I'll just tell you what we found out of 530. The majority, as you can see, were from Ontario. We had certainly participation from across the country, although not so much from Quebec, although we did have a survey translated and sent out in French, but we didn't get much take up. Most urban. You can see that the age range is definitely skewed toward people who are over 50, and indeed, many are over 60. And frankly, the history of refugee resettlement is such that you'll find that a lot of the heavy lifting is done by people who are retired. And that may be, at least in part, because refugee resettlement benefits from having people who can do it, who are flexible with their timing, who can be available, and so on. It may also be correlated with the involvement of church groups, because the sort of age cohort of people who are engaged with churches tends to be older as well. Vast majority of respondents were women, highly educated. Again, 42% retired or semi-retired. And this gives you a sense of their politics to the extent that they chose to answer. More data. They tend to be middle class or better, as it were, middle class or affluent. And again, that stands to reason because in order to sponsor, you have to fundraise. You either have to cut checks of your own or you have to be part of a social network that can fundraise. So no surprise. Okay. People ethnically identify overwhelmingly as European. Okay. And again, these are people who self-identify religiously. So there is a, sort of the 47% Christian, but 38% who see themselves as one way or another non-religious. The vast majority of people were first-time sponsors. And this is a distinctive effect of the Syrian resettlement project. A lot of people entered into this sphere who had never done it before. Okay. Now, in terms of how sponsor groups form, there's a longer story to be told, but as I mentioned to you, faith-based organizations have a long history of doing this. And one of the effects of that is that they have entered into long-term agreements with the government to facilitate and expedite refugee resettlement. And so there are organizations called sponsorship agreement holders who have long-standing contracts with the government to engage in refugee resettlement. And many of those, something like close to 70% of these sponsorship agreement holders are linked to faith-based organizations. Okay. But you can see here that with the Syrian resettlement, the majority of people who formed groups did so understanding themselves to be secular. Now, that doesn't mean that they wouldn't be affiliated to a sponsorship agreement holder that was faith-based for reasons of convenience and organization, and really borrowing from the expertise and experience of faith-based organizations. Okay. And so 72% were affiliated with a sponsorship agreement holder. Okay. Community sponsor, group of 5, these are other ways of forming a group. They tend to be a little bit more bureaucratically demanding because they don't benefit from the history of long collaboration that sponsorship agreement holders have with government. Okay. Most of these were privately sponsored, but we have a significant representation of the blended visa office referral program as well. Here's a point that's interesting, right? 3/4 of sponsors lived within a half-hour drive of the family they sponsored. And that's sort of interesting and noteworthy because of what it signifies in terms of enabling ongoing contact. Okay, and here's about use of translators. We asked about the motivation, and here we asked a variety of questions about what motivated people to enter into sponsorship. And certainly the vast majority, the answers were non-exclusive. People could tick off lots of boxes, but certainly people responded powerfully to it's the right thing to do. They were responsive to media coverage and to a lesser extent, at least in what they identified, to the photo of Alan Kurdi. A lot of them said that they were invited to join a group. And that tells us something about how civic engagement happens. How people do things because other people are doing them and invite them to join along. Okay. A significant number, as I noted earlier, who had a past experience of sponsorship were motivated by that past experience to engage in yet another sponsorship. With these, I think it's important and interesting to see the multiple layers at which people are responding, right? An ethical commitment, but having somebody actually ask you to do it plays a role. Here, I think it's also important to recognize the significance of having a private sponsorship regime that creates what I'll call an opportunity structure. That is, for people who want to do more than, let's say, write a check, right? When they see a photo of Alan Kurdi, or when they see, when they read in the paper about a refugee crisis, that's the first thing that people can think of doing, writing a check. But what refugee sponsorship does is it creates an opportunity structure within which they can channel a desire to do something more active. I dare say that a lot of people who got involved in refugee sponsorship following the Syrian refugee movement might not have fully appreciated what the demands would be, what the requirements would be. But what it did is it thrust them into a particularly intense and quotidian relationship with people that would not be anything like the experience of simply cutting a check. And in that sense, I think it was for many people quite transformative. Now, we sort of asked people how they evaluate the experience, and there are a variety of responses to this, but certainly by and large, most people evaluated it as a very positive experience, also very demanding, also very emotionally draining. And you can see here that a lot said that they would be involved in subsequent sponsorships, and many people, in fact, were. Okay. So this gives you a sense that overall, a lot of people found it to be a very rewarding experience. Not an easy experience necessarily, but a very rewarding one and a very meaningful one. Now, and here is sort of one of the quotes that we have. Now, let me back up for a moment and say, when we did our online survey, we created a space for people to write in responses, anything you'd like to say that wasn't captured in the survey. And we were quite astonished by how candid and open and nuanced people's write-in responses were. And frankly, how many people chose to give write-in responses that were really very revealing. We have followed this up as well with interviews that go on for an hour or 2 hours, over 85 of them. And so what I'm going to do from here on in is really speak a little bit about the qualitative responses people gave and use them to draw on some larger themes I see emerging from the data. What I'm doing here is giving you real snapshot quotes. They aren't intended to be representative. I don't think there is a majority view of anything. I'm just giving you snapshot insights into some of the answers that people provided. So I'll just begin, and these draw both from the write-in responses to the online survey and some of the interviews, which I'm in the process of coding from transcripts. So certainly several people talked about how rewarding it was. And there's lots more, many more quotes that I could offer you about this. I would also say that there are a number of people who talked about how difficult it was, how emotionally challenging it was. There were, but across the board, I would say there were a few who regretted doing it. There were disappointments, to be sure. It wasn't always what people expected. But not, perhaps I will just say that it had an impact on people. And you certainly got that sense from talking to people. Now, people brought different expectations to it, expectations of their own role and capacity, and expectations about families and refugees and what they thought would happen. And I'll try to tease that out a little bit as we go through this. Okay. One of the things that I was interested in exploring is how sponsors conceptualize the relationship that they have with the refugee family, newcomers that they sponsor. It is clear that the relationship is quite intense. It's demanding, right? It can start from before people arrive. Often there will be pre-arrival contact initiated by sponsors. But certainly it starts like at the airport by meeting families, and then it unfurls day by day. And these are quite intense quotidian interactions. There isn't really a model for it, right? For this kind of relationship that people have. And so I was interested in finding out how people described it, how sponsors understood it. And really they moved between metaphor, describing them as friends or like family or maybe acquaintances. And you can see that there is a kind of intimacy or intensity that people think of as associated with family, but also more of a casual, more of an idea of friendship. But it's also important to say that those are not, in a sense, points on a spectrum. They're different conceptualizations of relationships, right? And so in a sense, family are those to whom you feel an obligation and a responsibility, right? You may or may not like them as, families have lots of conflicts. It's not so much about how much you like them on a spectrum of, I like my friends, I love my family, but a kind of bond and sense that is mutually constituted and has a sense of duty and responsibility. Friendships tend to be more derived from affect, from knowing somebody, liking them, choosing to develop the relationship as you go. So in a sense, I would not try to reduce a description of like family versus like friends to any kind of distill it into any particular definition. Now, one of the most interesting responses we had was a man who said, they're kind of like family, kind of like that uncle at the wedding who, kind of behaves in unusual ways, but that you feel quite connected to them. Is he a friend? Well, I wouldn't call him up and go for a beer with him, but he's kind of more like this family. And this indeed was a sponsor whose family was also Middle Eastern. And it was quite interesting for him to move between different conceptions of family and friendship that he understood from both of those identities that he occupied. Now, there is obviously, I think it goes without saying, a hierarchical relationship between refugee sponsors and those who are sponsored. Those gradients occur along the lines of status, language knowledge, location within the state, income, class, all sorts of things. There may not be a gradient of education, but typically in the case of Syrian refugees who are highly educated, they struggle to have their education recognized, right? So there are all sorts of obvious power imbalances between sponsors and those who are sponsored. That in itself is completely unsurprising. What is interesting, I think, in at least the findings that we have so far, is how aware of it sponsors often are and how they do or do not negotiate that power imbalance. Okay? So there's a recognition of it, sometimes a discomfort about it, but certainly a recognition. And a belief often that it can be mitigated, overcome, or evolve over time. One of the more interesting observations about this relationship idea, what kind of relationship do sponsors understand themselves to have, emerged through the language of not just their like family, but a relationship to refugees and the family that bordered on, I don't mean this, well, it sounds disparaging, as if they are like children, as if the project of sponsorship is somehow like raising a family. And I'll just give you a moment to take a look at these two quotes. Now, at first instance, I think this analogy to family is itself riddled with problematic things. Certainly ideas of hierarchy and power and all that we know about the structural inequalities embedded in family. So deeply problematic, right? But I want to complicate that a little bit, or at least nuance it. I don't want to deny it, but I do want to complicate it a bit. One thing I want you to notice as well here is, one of the respondents who describes his motivation for sponsorship through the language of faith and faithfulness. I think it's also important to acknowledge that and the role that it's playing in many people's sponsorship motivations. Now, this idea of raising a family, raising kids, right? It sounds infantilizing and disrespectful, and for all the obvious reasons that I won't belabor here. But I want to pull back for a moment and say something about how there is a way in which this kind of relationship, which I call parentalism, I want to move away a little bit from calling it paternalism, but parentalism is baked into refugee sponsorship in a structural sense. And the way I want to explain it here is by lining up on the one side, the undertaking in Canadian immigration law that sponsors must sign in order to sponsor family members. For those of you who aren't familiar with this, one of the ways in which people can immigrate to Canada is by being sponsored by family members. So I could sponsor my spouse from abroad. I could sponsor my child. I could sponsor my father or mother or whatever, right? That's family class sponsorship. But in order to do that, I have to give an undertaking to the state that I will support that family member for a stipulated period of time. And if you look on the left, you can see that this is what Canadian immigration law requires of those who seek to sponsor their family members as permanent residents to Canada. Okay. Now, if you look to the right, you will see the undertaking that refugee sponsors, private sponsors, must sign as a condition of sponsoring a refugee family. And I hope what you can see is the isomorphism, the symmetry between the way in which law structures family class sponsorship under immigration law and how it structures refugee sponsorship under our law governing refugee resettlement. And so, without wanting to overstate it, the analogy that some sponsors reach for, that this is like raising kids, this is like raising a family, doesn't come out of nowhere, okay? And that there is a structural dimension to it. And so I want to track that a little bit without, again, and I want to say this, emphasize, without trying to validate it, right? Without saying it's a good or appropriate thing. I'm just trying to give an account of it. Okay. So here's one way in which we might see this. Okay. One of the challenges that refugee sponsors identified and that we kind of asked them about is how do they balance the task of providing guidance, assisting newcomers in how to get settled, how to manage their affairs, how to integrate, how to achieve their aspirations, right? Well, sponsors think that it's part of their job to provide guidance. Why? Because they live here, they know things, they have a certain experience and expertise and so on, right? But of course, newcomers aren't their children, literally, and they're adults, at least the parents are, and can make decisions for themselves. They are autonomous adults. And how do sponsors balance or recognize that tension between providing guidance, because that's kind of what they're supposed to do, and respecting the autonomy of newcomers? And I think you can see here from these quotes that they struggle with it. Now, so two things to really point out here. One, they recognize it as a struggle. And secondly, they have issues around how they do it. Okay. Not only do they recognize it and struggle with it, but there will be, and I recognize in reading interviews, considerable struggle within sponsorship groups between sponsors about how to do it. And as an aside, it's quite interesting that in more than a few of the interviews I have read and conducted, people say that they consider their experience of working with the refugee family to be wonderful. The experience of working with the sponsorship group, not so much. A lot of conflict about these sorts of issues, about different values and principles within the refugee sponsorship group, and different priorities, right? And this led to considerable struggle. One of the things I'd also like you to notice from the quote I give you here is what turns out to be an absolutely typical basis of challenge and struggle around this guidance versus autonomy: smoking, right? The idea that an adult might smoke, and sponsors will be quite concerned about smoking because it's costly, because it's unhealthy, because landlords won't rent to people who smoke, and all of these sorts of things. And they struggle with having to stand back and deal with the fact that this is not their decision to make, right? And this is just a tip. This, I would say, is actually kind of a typical example of that. Okay. Another axis or another pivot point for struggle, both with sponsors and the families they worked with, but also within sponsorship groups, is how to appropriately decide how much support to give versus when to stand back and let people, or encourage or require people to exercise independence and move toward, what they consider to be self-sufficiency. How much do you do for the family in order to assist them? And when is it appropriate to stand back and say, nope, this is something that you should be prepared and you have to learn or whatever, do on your own. And this also turned out to be, again, a site of struggle, particularly around language training and employment. And it didn't always move in the same direction. So you'd have some sponsorship groups who really were unhappy that, typically, the father of the family wanted to go out and get a job right away. And the sponsorship group thought this was not a good idea because you can get a job right away, but you're not going to improve your language skills, and then you're going to be stuck in a low-wage occupation indefinitely. That might be a problem. Or the flip side, which was the sponsorship group was very concerned that the family becomes self-sufficient as soon as possible, because self-sufficiency, you will have read from the sponsorship undertaking, is part of the mission, if you will, of refugee resettlement. And whereas the adults might have said, no, we want to spend time learning the language. We need to get our grounding first in the language before we look for work. Okay? Sometimes sponsorship groups and families were in concert, had shared the same view of that, and that was fine, but sometimes they didn't, right? And where families were not able to become economically self-sufficient within the year, this was sometimes a concern or an issue for the sponsoring family, the sponsorship group rather. Okay. So something related to this that we asked people about was, from the sponsorship perspective, what is their definition of success? What does a successful sponsorship mean to them as sponsors? And again, I'll just give you a moment to take a look at this. Okay. I'm going to scroll down to another example. What I want to say about these quotes is the following. The government's vision of success for refugee resettlement is that at the end of the 12 months of sponsorship, the family will be flourishing, economically self-sufficient, employed, children will be in school, everything will be going smoothly. That's success within the government framing of resettlement. And indeed, there are those families for whom that turns out to be an accurate prediction. It turns out to be within the realm of possibility for them. And for those sponsors that we interviewed, whose families were walking along that path, they, at the end of the year, the parents were employed, the children were in school, everything was happening, they could say, well, we were really successful, the sponsorship was successful, the family is successful because they are self-sufficient, independent, employed, kids are in school, and so on. in a way, that's not surprising. What was more interesting to me and to us was how sponsors came to think and rethink the meaning of success when the family that they sponsored wasn't in that situation in what is now called month 13. And so what I think is interesting from these quotes is how in various ways sponsors came to redefine what they thought of as success, and to get a bit of critical traction on the kinds of expectations that are brought to bear on refugees who are resettled, bearing in mind the challenges they face, the trauma they've experienced, the adaptation that they need time to experience. And so one of the things that I found particularly interesting then is what the impact on sponsors is of walking with people through this process and seeing directly how the expectations that the idealized version of resettlement puts on people can't always be realized, right? And what does one do with that gap? Does one then describe the sponsorship as a failure? Well, some sponsors do. Do the sponsors understand themselves as having failed? Well, sometimes they wonder if they could have done things differently. But it also leads to, I think, in many cases, a more capacious, a more thoughtful, and a more nuanced understanding of what success might mean. Right? So in the first one, regarding the woman, there's a woman whose husband was killed, young, she's got 3 young children, and the youngest, the daughter, has a significant cognitive impairment. So, the sponsor recognizes that there's a good chance, and the woman herself is having an extraordinarily hard time learning in English. So the sponsor recognizes that the woman may in fact remain on social assistance for a very long time, maybe forever. Maybe she'll get a job under the table, which would be a good thing now, right? So the idea of working under the table, not such a bad thing. Her sons are going to be just fine. They're flourishing. That's a success. That the daughter who has these very profound needs is getting the help she needs. That's a success, right? So I think it's interesting to see that, and I'm interested in what that kind of recognition, what kind of ramifications that might have politically in a larger sense. Now, there are many questions that, even the preliminary findings lead one to ask more than I can possibly kind of talk about here, but let me just put up a few of them. Okay. So I'm interested, and I'll just leave this with you. I started with this idea of hospitality and a theoretical exploration of cosmopolitanism, which I have omitted for today. But one of the questions is, what kind of transformative potential does sponsorship have on a relationship in which hierarchy is to some extent embedded? Can it shift? Can it be displaced? Can it be superseded by something else? Or is it static? Right? How do people negotiate that? Is sponsorship an exercise of humanitarianism, solidarity, or a catalyst between its starting point, which is, I think, largely humanitarian, and something else, right? So again, I'm interested in the evolution over time. I haven't spoken much here about the so-called private dimension of sponsorship, but I'll say 2 things about it in closing. One is that so-called private sponsorship is less private than you would think, right? It's much more like what I call a public-private partnership with government, because so many of the services are still provided by government. But I'm also interested in what kind of politicization arises from private sponsors, understanding that they have a stake, they're doing a kind of heavy lifting in resettlement, and what traction does that give them, or does it make them think they have or ought to have in making political demands on government with respect to resettlement of refugees? And I've seen some evidence of that, and I'd be happy to talk about it. And finally, what does sponsorship do for sponsors' own understanding of themselves as citizens and for people engaged in what I describe as acts of citizenship? There was a time when people would come together certainly during wartime, and collaborate and make sacrifices and give themselves over to collective projects, public work in the service of defeating the external other, the enemy other. In its most optimistic light, in its most, if I can give it its most attractive depiction, refugee sponsorship involves a group of citizens coming together, pooling their resources, sacrificing and giving themselves over to the public work, not of defeating the enemy other, but of welcoming the other and putting that person on a path to a situation where hospitality will no longer be necessary or even an appropriate term, because hospitality is something you show to strangers, and ultimately sponsorship is about creating belonging. So with that, I will pause and open it up for questions and discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Macklin. That was a very thought-provoking talk, and I have no idea that there will be questions for you. I don't see any questions in the chat box. So just to remind everybody, the recording will now stop. So the question and answer session will not be recorded, should that be of concern. And do feel free to type a question in the chat box if you prefer, or use the little raise hand icon, which should be at the bottom of your screen.